The moment I took my first breath, my parents had already decided what would flow through my veins for the rest of my life. Not blood type or genetic traits, but something far more insidious, something that would shape every gathering, every celebration, every quiet Tuesday night in our suburban Denver home. My parents, Margaret and Robert Sullivan, weren't just social drinkers. They were architects of a family tradition that stretched back through generations, each one more devoted than the last to what they called the Sullivan way of bonding. Growing up in our pristine two-story house in Cherry Creek, with its manicured lawn and white picket fence, you'd never guess the darkness that unfolded behind those French doors. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. My father worked as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company, always dressed in crisp suits and speaking with the confidence of a man who'd never met a deal he couldn't close. My mother ran her own interior design business, transforming Denver's most exclusive homes into magazine-worthy showcases. They were respected members of the country club, regular attendees at charity galas, and hosts of legendary 4th of July barbecues that the whole neighborhood anticipated each year. But when I turned 11, everything changed. It was a crisp October evening, and the aspens outside were burning gold against the Colorado sky. My older brother Marcus, then 14, and I were called down to the dining room after dinner. The mahogany table that usually held my mother's prized orchid centerpiece had been cleared, and in its place sat a collection of bottles that gleamed under the chandelier light like liquid jewels. My father stood at the head of the table, a proud smile spreading across his face as if he were about to present us with the greatest gift imaginable. "This is your heritage," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. "The Sullivans have always understood that families who share everything, who experience life together without barriers or pretense, are families that endure. Tonight, you begin to understand what that means." My mother nodded beside him, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap, her expression one of serene approval. What they called sharing and bonding, I would later understand as systematic conditioning. But at 11, all I knew was the burning sensation that scorched my throat when they poured that first shot of whiskey. The rules were simple and non-negotiable. Every Friday became what they termed preparation night, though preparation for what remained unclear to my young mind. We would gather in the formal living room, the one reserved for special occasions, where my parents had assembled what looked like a sophisticated bar straight out of a Manhattan speakeasy. Crystal decanters held amber liquids that caught the light, while silver shakers stood ready for my mother's signature martinis. They taught us to hold our liquor with the same precision they taught us to hold our forks at dinner. Proper posture, controlled sips, and most importantly, never show weakness. If Marcus or I grimaced after a shot, if our faces betrayed the revolt happening in our bodies, the consequences were swift and creative. Sometimes it was physical training until our muscles screamed louder than our stomachs churned. Other times, it was writing essays about family loyalty and strength, pages upon pages about why the Sullivan tradition mattered more than temporary discomfort. My father's favorite punishment was what he called resilience rounds, where we'd have to do additional shots while maintaining conversation about our day at school, training us to function despite the poison coursing through our systems. Marcus took to it like he'd been born for this moment. Within months, he could match my father drink for drink, his teenage frame somehow absorbing the alcohol with an efficiency that earned him praise and rewards I could only dream of. By the time he was 15, he'd become my father's weekend companion, the two of them spending Saturdays at sports bars, teaching him to read the room, to hold his own among grown men who saw drinking as a competitive sport. My mother would beam when they returned, Marcus slightly swaying but still articulate, still charming. Still her golden boy who was carrying on the family legacy with such natural grace. I became the family disappointment not through any dramatic rebellion, but through quiet excellence in everything except what mattered to them. While Marcus collected shot glasses from different states like trophies, I collected academic awards. While he perfected the art of the morning after recovery, I perfected my debate techniques, leading our team to state championships. I worked evenings and weekends at a local bookstore, saving every penny for a future that existed somewhere beyond the reach of crystal decanters and preparation nights. My parents watched my achievements with the kind of distant politeness reserved for a neighbor's child, acknowledging them without truly seeing them. "Your problem," my mother would say, usually after her third gin and tonic, "is that you think you're better than your own blood. You judge us instead of joining us. Look at Marcus. Look how happy he is." Her words would slur slightly at the edges, but her disappointment came through crystal clear. She gestured toward my brother, who by 16 had developed the telltale puffiness around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands before his first drink of the day. Happy wasn't the word I'd use, but I learned to keep such observations to myself. The sophistication of their approach was what made it so insidious. This wasn't some backwoods moonshine operation or obvious neglect that would raise red flags. They couched everything in terms of culture and refinement. They taught us about wine pairings and the proper way to nose whiskey. They bought books about cocktail history and took us to upscale restaurants where they'd order flights of rare spirits, making it all seem like education rather than indoctrination. To the outside world, they were simply cultured parents sharing their appreciation for the finer things with their children. I considered reaching out for help more times than I could count. But my best friend Emma had tried that with her own troubled family situation, and the aftermath still haunted her. The social worker had spent 45 minutes in their home, accepted her parents' explanations at face value, and left Emma to face the consequences of her betrayal, as her father called it. The bruises faded eventually, but the lesson remained. The system wasn't designed to recognize abuse that came wrapped in prosperity and presented with articulate explanations from well-dressed parents. So I developed my own survival strategies. I became a master of illusion, learning to pour drinks down heating vents when no one was looking, to mime the effects of alcohol with Oscar-worthy performances. I'd sway when I was supposed to sway, laugh too loud at my father's repeated stories, and let my words occasionally tumble over each other in practiced imperfection. The potted plants in our home thrived on a steady diet of expensive scotch, while I maintained my sobriety behind a carefully crafted facade of compliance. The real test came during Marcus's 19th birthday celebration. It was a Saturday in late May, and my parents had pulled out all the stops. The backyard was transformed into what they called a garden of earthly delights, with stations featuring spirits from around the world. Extended family had gathered, aunts and uncles who shared the Sullivan philosophy, cousins who'd been through their own preparation nights. It was a convention of generational trauma dressed up as a birthday party. Marcus had been complaining about stabbing pains in his side for weeks, but he'd learned to medicate his discomfort the family way. That afternoon, under the string lights and surrounded by relatives raising toasts to his bright future, his skin had taken on a yellowish cast that the golden hour lighting couldn't quite disguise. When he doubled over near the champagne fountain, clutching his abdomen, most of the family laughed. "Can't handle the celebration of your own party," his uncle Christopher joked, raising another toast to the lightweight birthday boy. My father's response still echoes in my nightmares. He emerged from the house carrying a bottle of 25-year-old Macallan, the crown jewel of his collection, supposedly saved for the most momentous occasions. "Nothing a proper drink can't fix," he announced, filling a tumbler well past what anyone would call a reasonable pour. "This'll put hair on your chest and steel in your spine." The gathered relatives applauded as if he'd just performed a magic trick, while my mother pulled out her phone to record the moment for posterity, narrating for the video about how proud she was of her son becoming a true Sullivan man. That's when something inside me finally shattered. The facade I'd maintained for years cracked as I watched my brother accept that glass with shaking hands. His body clearly screaming for help while surrounded by people who confuse slow suicide with family bonding. I made a decision that would change everything, though at the time, I told myself it was just about surviving until I could escape to college. If they needed me to be a Sullivan, I'd be a Sullivan. But I'd do it on my own terms. I threw myself into the performance with a dedication that surprised everyone, especially myself. I matched their drinks, told raucous stories that had uncles slapping their knees, and even proposed increasingly creative toasts that had my mother wiping away tears of joy. For the first time in years, I felt the warmth of their approval washing over me like sunshine after a long winter. The terrible irony was that in pretending to be what they wanted, I finally understood the seductive comfort of belonging, even if that belonging came at the cost of everything else. College acceptance letters became my lifeline. When Oregon State University offered me a partial scholarship, I accepted without hesitation, drawn by the promise of distance and the anonymity of the Pacific Northwest. My parents were lukewarm about my choice, disappointed I hadn't selected their alma mater where the Sullivan drinking traditions could continue under the watchful eye of familiar networks. But they consoled themselves with the thought that I'd finally shown proper family spirit, and surely that would survive a few years of misguided independence. What I discovered at Oregon State was a revelation that reshaped my entire understanding of normal. My randomly assigned roommate, Jessica Chen, was in recovery from her own battle with alcohol, 2 years sober and majoring in addiction counseling. Through her, I found a world I didn't know existed. One where Friday nights could be spent hiking instead of drinking, where social bonding happened over board games and deep conversations rather than shot glasses and slurred speeches. She introduced me to the campus recovery community, a group of students who met weekly to support each other in staying sober or exploring sobriety. At first, I attended meetings with the anthropological curiosity of someone studying a foreign culture. These people spoke about alcohol as if it were an enemy they'd battled, not a family member they were required to embrace. They shared stories that could have been ripped from my own life, except in their versions, the ending involved recognition, recovery, and the radical act of choosing a different path. I learned terms I'd never heard before like enabling, codependency, and intergenerational trauma. Suddenly, the Sullivan family tradition had clinical terminology that stripped away its pretense of sophistication. Dr. Patricia Williams, who ran the Campus Counseling Center's addiction education program, became an unexpected mentor. A former prosecutor who'd switched careers after her own family's struggle with substance abuse, she had a way of cutting through denial with surgical precision. During one of her seminars on the neuroscience of addiction, she explained how genetic predisposition combined with early exposure created a perfect storm for dependency. Every word felt like she was reading from the hidden handbook of my family's dysfunction. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to be genuinely clear-headed. Not the fake sobriety I'd performed at home, but actual clarity that came from weeks and then months without any alcohol in my system. I started training for marathons, something that would have been impossible while maintaining the Sullivan lifestyle. My grades soared even higher, my debate performances became legendary on campus, and I discovered I actually enjoyed social situations when I could remember them the next day. The fog I hadn't even realized I was living in began to lift, revealing a world with sharper edges and brighter colors. But with clarity came anger. The more I learned about healthy family dynamics, the more I recognized the depth of what had been stolen from Marcus and me. Other students complained about their parents being too strict or too permissive, while I sat silent, unable to explain that my parents had literally trained us to poison ourselves as a bonding exercise. The rage built slowly, like pressure in a sealed container, until I made a decision that I would later recognize as both brave and incredibly naive. I decided to go home for winter break of my sophomore year. But this wouldn't be a typical visit. Prepared for weeks, gathering resources about family addiction, printing out studies about the dangers of underage drinking, collecting testimonials from other families who had broken similar cycles. I even bought alcohol-free alternatives to show that celebrations could happen without intoxication. My roommate Jessica helped me practice conversations, role-playing different scenarios of how my family might respond. In my mind, I'd return as an enlightened messenger, opening their eyes to the possibility of change. The 3-hour drive from Corvallis to Denver gave me too much time to oscillate between hope and dread. I'd created an entire fantasy about how it would unfold. Maybe they'd be receptive. Maybe seeing me thriving without alcohol would plant seeds of doubt about their methods. Maybe Marcus, now 21 and legally allowed to destroy himself, would see an alternative path. By the time I pulled into the familiar driveway past the perfectly trimmed hedges and seasonal decorations my mother had professionally installed, I'd almost convinced myself that change was possible. The front door had barely closed behind me when my father thrust a beer into my hands. "There's our college party girl," he boomed, pulling me into a hug that smelled of whiskey and false joviality. Home for the holidays and ready to show these Portland hipsters how real families celebrate. When I politely declined, explaining that I was training for a race and had cut out alcohol, the atmosphere shifted like a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a storm. My mother appeared from the kitchen, her face a masterpiece of practiced concern hiding genuine offense. "Oh, so you're one of those now," she said, the word "those" dripping with disdain. "Too good for your own family. I suppose they taught you that we're all just a bunch of alcoholics who need intervention." Her voice carried that dangerous edge I remembered from childhood, the tone that preceded either crying jags or rage, depending on how much she'd already had to drink that day. Dinner became a battleground disguised as a meal. Every time I reached for water instead of wine, my father made increasingly pointed comments about uptight intellectuals who thought they were better than everyone else. My mother's contributions were more subtle, but equally cutting, wondering aloud whether I'd also become too enlightened to appreciate the family recipes I'd grown up with, or if those had been poisoned by association too. Marcus, what had you're not my father. When I vom, they spent, but whether they dumped, when they, I waited until their voices moved downstairs, then used my phone to dial 911. whispering my address to the dispatcher while huddled in my closet among clothes that still smelled like the teenage girl who'd once believed she could save her family. The siren started as a distant wail, growing louder until they couldn't be ignored. Through the crack under my door, I watched the hallway light up in alternating red and blue. My parents' laughter cut off abruptly, replaced by the kind of silence that precedes disasters. I heard my mother's voice, suddenly sharp and sober-sounding, asking my father if he'd heard that. My father's response was to move toward the window, and I could imagine him pulling back the curtain to see the emergency vehicles pulling up to our perfect suburban home. "Someone called the cops," he announced, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and the first stirrings of panic. They both turned toward my room, and I held my breath, phone still clutched in my hand, pretending to be unconscious on my bed. Heavy footsteps approached, and my father's hand gripped my shoulder, shaking me roughly. "She's out cold," he called back to my mother. The doorbell rang, followed by authoritative knocking that seemed to echo through the house like Judgment Day arriving. "Police, open up!" a deep voice commanded. My mother scrambled for air freshener, spraying it frantically around the house while kicking broken glass under furniture. The Christmas tree lights twinkled mockingly as she tried to erase evidence of what they'd done. "Get Marcus down here and tell him to act normal," she hissed at my father, who was already plastering on his salesman's smile, the one that had closed million-dollar deals and charmed country club committees. Through barely open eyes, I watched Marcus stumble down the stairs, bumping into walls, his body betraying what his face tried to hide. Even in the dim light, his skin looked waxy and wrong, like a mannequin version of my brother. "Stand up straight," my father commanded, slapping Marcus's back in what might have looked fraternal to an outsider, but carried the force of desperation. "Remember, we were just having a quiet family evening." The front door opened, and two officers stood silhouetted against the porch light. "Evening, officers," my father said smoothly, his voice revealing none of the panic I'd seen moments before. "Is there some kind of problem?" The taller officer peered past him into our home, taking in the scene with eyes trained to spot what people tried to hide. "We received a 911 call from this address," he said. "Report of a disturbance." "Must be a mistake," my father insisted. "We're just having a quiet family night, catching up with our daughter who's home from college." That's when I made my entrance. Stumbled out of my room, vomit still streaking my Oregon State hoodie, throat raw from the forced alcohol and subsequent purging. The female officer's eyes immediately locked onto me, taking in every detail of my appearance. "Miss, are you all right?" she asked, stepping forward despite my father's attempt to block her path. Before I could speak, my mother rushed over, wrapping her arm around me in a parody of maternal concern. "Oh, officers," she said, her voice dripping with false embarrassment. "I'm so sorry you were called out here. Sophie had a bit too much to drink at her college reunion earlier. You know how these kids are when they come home, trying to show off how much they can handle now. We were just getting her to bed." She squeezed my shoulder hard enough to bruise, a warning disguised as comfort. The male officer wasn't buying it. His eyes traveled from my mother's perfectly composed face to my father's rigid smile, to Marcus swaying in the background despite his attempts to lean casually against the wall. "We'd like to speak with each family member separately," the female officer announced, pulling out a notepad. "Starting with you, miss," she said, looking directly at me. "Why don't we step outside for some fresh air?" The December night was sharp with cold, but the air felt like liberation after the suffocating atmosphere inside. Standing on the front porch with neighbors' Christmas lights twinkling in witness, I finally found my voice. "They held me down," I said, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "My parents held me down and forced alcohol down my throat because I refused to drink with them. They've been doing this since I was 11 years old, every Friday. They call it preparation night. My brother needs medical attention. Look at his skin. He's been sick for weeks, but they just keep giving him more alcohol." The officers exchanged glances, and the female officer guided me to sit on the porch steps while her partner went back inside. Through the open door, I could hear my father's voice, now tinged with indignation. "This is ridiculous. We're a respected family in this community. My wife runs her own business. I'm a regional director. We're not some trashy family with problems. Our daughter has clearly been influenced by extremist views at that liberal college. She's making up stories for attention." The male officer's response was measured but firm. "Sir, we're going to need to see everyone's identification, and we'll be conducting field sobriety tests." My mother's shrill voice joined the chorus. "This is harassment. We know our rights. You can't just come into our home and make accusations based on the word of a manipulative child who's angry about reasonable family boundaries." But even as she protested, Marcus chose that moment to prove my point by stumbling toward a potted plant and vomiting violently. his body convulsing with the effort. The sound of his distress cut through my parents' performance like a blade through silk. The next hours blurred together in a chaos of procedures and revelations. Paramedics arrived to examine Marcus, their professional assessment cutting through years of family denial. His liver enzymes were dangerously elevated, his skin showing clear signs of jaundice, his body bearing the accumulated damage of a decade of sanctioned abuse. As they prepared to transport him to the hospital, he looked at me with eyes that seemed to see clearly for the first time in years. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for not protecting you, for being too weak to fight them." My parents were arrested for child endangerment, assault, and forced consumption of alcohol to a minor since I was still 20 years old. As they were led away in handcuffs, the perfect suburban facade finally cracking completely, my mother's final words to me were not of love or concern, but of rage. "You've destroyed this family," she screamed. "Generations of tradition ruined by one selfish girl who thinks she's better than her own blood." The neighbors had gathered by then, watching the Sullivan family empire crumble on a December night when the only thing that should have been broken was wrapping paper. The police station became my temporary refuge while statements were given and evidence collected. I showed them videos I'd secretly recorded over the years, including recent footage of my parents laughing about breaking me back in. The detective, a woman named Grace Martinez who'd seen too many families destroyed by addiction, listened to my story with a combination of professional detachment and genuine concern. "You were brave to call us," she said, "but I need you to understand this is just the beginning of a very difficult journey." She was right, of course. The immediate crisis had passed, but the aftershocks would reverberate through every aspect of our lives. Marcus was admitted to the hospital with acute liver failure, his body finally surrendering to the decade of poison it had been forced to process. The doctors spoke in careful medical terms, but the message was clear. Without immediate intervention and likely a liver transplant, my brother wouldn't see another birthday. The golden child of the Sullivan family tradition was dying from its legacy. My extended family rallied around my parents, not in support of their actions, but in defense of the family name. Uncle Christopher, my father's brother who'd hosted his own version of preparation nights, hired the best defense attorneys money could buy. Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister, started a whisper campaign about my instability, suggesting that I'd been influenced by radical sobriety culture at college. The family Facebook page became a battlefield of competing narratives, with cousins choosing sides and family friends expressing shock that such a respectable family could harbor such darkness. But something unexpected happened as news of the arrest spread through our Denver suburb. Other families began coming forward with their own stories. The Johnsons from 2 streets over admitted their son had been hospitalized after a Sullivan family gathering where underage drinking was not just permitted, but enforced. The Martinezes revealed they'd stopped accepting our invitations after witnessing preparation night during a dinner party. The Petersons confessed they'd been conducting their own version with their children, inspired by my parents' sophisticated approach to what they called building tolerance. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rebecca Thompson who'd built her career on protecting children, saw an opportunity to address a broader pattern. What started as charges against my parents expanded into an investigation of what she termed an intergenerational abuse network. 5 families in total were eventually implicated, all successful professionals who'd convinced themselves that forcing alcohol on their children was a cultural tradition rather than criminal abuse. During this time, I lived in a strange limbo. The university granted me emergency leave to deal with the family crisis, and I split my time between Marcus's hospital room and meetings with prosecutors. My brother's condition deteriorated daily, his body too damaged to recover without intervention. The transplant list was long, and his years of alcohol abuse put him low on the priority scale. I watched him fade a little more each day, his skin taking on the gray pallor of impending organ failure, while machines increasingly took over the functions his body could no longer perform. One evening, as I sat beside his bed, reading updates from the legal proceedings on my phone, Marcus spoke with more clarity than he'd managed in days. "Do you remember when we were little?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before the preparation nights. When we used to build forts in the backyard and pretend we were explorers." I did remember. Summer afternoons when our biggest concern was whether Mom would let us have popsicles before dinner. When Dad's arrival home meant piggyback rides and bedtime stories, not lessons in liquor tolerance. "I think about that sometimes," he continued, machines beeping softly around us, about who we might have been if they'd just let us be kids. Maybe I'd have been an engineer like I wanted. Remember how I used to take apart everything just to see how it worked? before everything became about proving I could drink like a Sullivan man. The grief in his voice was almost harder to bear than his physical deterioration. He'd lost not just his health, but his entire sense of self to our parents' twisted legacy. During one particularly bad night, when the doctors warned he might not make it to morning, Marcus made a request that shocked everyone. He wanted to marry his girlfriend, Alexandra, whom he'd been dating since high school. She was one of the few people who'd stuck by him through his descent into alcohol dependency, though my parents had always dismissed her as not being Sullivan material. Alexandra arrived at the hospital within an hour, wedding rings purchased from the hospital gift shop, and they were married by the chaplain with me and a nurse as witnesses. It wasn't the wedding anyone dreams of, with the groom connected to life support and the bride wearing jeans and running shoes. But there was something profound about watching my brother commit to love and future in the face of death, rejecting the Sullivan tradition of isolation and choosing connection instead. Alexandra was 3 months pregnant, news she'd been waiting to share until Marcus was stable. The possibility of new life in the midst of so much destruction felt like defiance against everything our parents had built. The next morning brought unexpected hope. A matching liver had become available, and despite his complicated medical history, Marcus was approved for the transplant. As they wheeled him into surgery, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Promise me something," he said. "If I make it through this, we tell everything. Every family gathering, every forced drink, every tradition that nearly killed us. We burn it all down so no other kids go through what we did." I promised, squeezing his hand back, watching them take my brother away for a surgery that would either save him or mark the end of the Sullivan family line. The 8-hour surgery stretched like eternity. Alexandra and I sat in the waiting room, surrounded by other families holding their own vigils. She told me stories about the Marcus she'd fallen in love with, the glimpses of who he was when alcohol wasn't controlling his life, how he taught himself guitar and written her songs, how he dreamed of starting a sustainable farming business, how gentle he was despite the violence of his upbringing. She painted a picture of the man he could have been, might still be, if his body accepted this second chance. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings continued to unfold. My parents' trial date was set, and the prosecutor was building a comprehensive case that would expose not just individual actions, but systematic abuse disguised as family tradition. Other victims came forward, some from our generation, others from our parents' generation, who'd finally found the courage to speak about their own preparation nights. The Sullivan family tradition, it turned out, was just one tentacle of a larger monster that had been feeding on children for decades. The surgeon finally emerged after what felt like a lifetime, exhaustion evident in her posture, but a small smile playing at her lips. "The transplant was successful," she announced. "His body is accepting the new liver. The next 24 hours are critical, but we're optimistic." Alexandra collapsed against me in relief, both of us crying for the brother and partner who'd been given a chance to live, to heal, to break the cycle that had nearly claimed him. Recovery was slow and painful. Marcus spent weeks in the hospital, his body learning to function without the constant presence of alcohol it had known since childhood. The physical withdrawal was brutal, but the psychological withdrawal was worse. Never learned to cope with emotions without numbing them. Never developed social skills that didn't revolve around drinking. The hospital's addiction counselor worked with him daily, unraveling years of programming that told him his worth was measured in his tolerance for poison. During this time, our parents' trial began. I testified for hours, detailing the systematic abuse disguised as family bonding. The prosecution presented videos, medical records, and witness testimony that painted a picture of calculated child endangerment. My parents' defense tried to frame it as cultural tradition taken too far, as misguided parenting rather than criminal abuse. They presented character witnesses who testified about their professional success and community involvement, as if running a successful business somehow negated forcing alcohol down children's throats. The other families involved received their own trials, and the media attention was intense. "Suburban drinking scandal exposes dark family traditions." The headline screamed. Think pieces were written about generational trauma and the ways successful families could hide abuse behind closed doors. Our neighbors were interviewed, many expressing shock that such things could happen in their safe, upscale community. The country club quietly revoked my parents' membership, more concerned about association with scandal than the actual abuse. Some extended family members tried to pressure me into dropping charges, showing up at the hospital to plead for family loyalty. "Think about your parents' reputations," Aunt Patricia begged. "Think about what this is doing to the Sullivan name. They made mistakes, but destroying their lives won't fix anything." I looked at Marcus, still fighting for each breath, his body bearing the scars of their mistakes, and felt my resolve harden like steel. The Sullivan name deserved to be destroyed if it required children to sacrifice their health on its altar. The verdicts came down on a Thursday afternoon in March. Guilty on all counts. My parents were sentenced to 5 years in prison, though they'd likely serve less with good behavior. It felt both like too much and not enough. 5 years for a lifetime of damage, for Marcus's failing liver, for childhood stolen in the name of tradition, but it was something. It was acknowledgement that what they'd done was wrong, criminal, deserving of punishment. It was the first time anyone had told the Sullivan family that their tradition was not sacred but sick. My mother maintained her composure until the moment the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Then she looked directly at me and mouthed words that required no sound to understand. "I'll never forgive you." My father didn't even look in my direction, his face set in the same expression he wore during failed business deals, already calculating his next move. They were led away to begin their sentences, and I felt not the satisfaction I'd expected, but a hollow emptiness where family was supposed to be. The other families received similar sentences, creating a strange fellowship among their children. We formed an informal support group, meeting monthly to process what it meant to be survivors of systematic family abuse. Some, like me, had found sobriety and were building new lives. Others struggled with addiction themselves, the training too deeply embedded to easily overcome. We shared resources, celebrated milestones, and held space for the complicated grief of losing families who were still alive but irredeemable. Marcus's recovery continued slowly but steadily. The new liver gave him a chance his body hadn't had in years, and he grabbed it with both hands. He entered a 90-day rehabilitation program, learning for the first time how to exist in the world without alcohol as a mediator. Alexandra stood by him, their daughter growing inside her, a future they were determined would never know preparation nights or family traditions that required sacrifice of health and happiness. I returned to Oregon State, forever changed by the months of crisis. My professors and classmates welcomed me back with support I hadn't expected. The story had made national news, and I found myself reluctantly cast as a spokesperson for breaking cycles of family addiction. Speaking requests came from recovery organizations and child welfare groups, wanting me to share how I'd found the strength to make that 911 call. I accepted some, using the platform to advocate for better recognition of abuse in affluent families, for understanding that trauma doesn't always look like poverty or obvious neglect. Life developed a new rhythm. Weekly therapy sessions helped me process the guilt that came with being the family destroyer, even though I knew I'd actually been the family savior. I trained for and ran 3 marathons that year, each finish line representing another milestone in my recovery from a childhood spent drowning. Academic achievements came easier now that my energy wasn't spent maintaining elaborate facades, and I switched my major to public health with a focus on addiction prevention. Marcus and Alexandra welcomed their daughter, Elena, on a September morning when the leaves were just starting to turn. Holding my niece for the first time, her tiny fingers wrapping around mine with instinctive trust, I made a silent promise that she would never question whether family love required sacrifice of self. She would grow up knowing that celebration didn't require intoxication, that bonding happened through presence, not proof of tolerance, that the only tradition worth maintaining was one of health and genuine connection. My parents served 3 years of their 5-year sentence, released early for good behavior and completion of a substance abuse program that they treated as just another performance to get through. They moved to Arizona, starting fresh where the Sullivan name didn't carry the weight of scandal. They sent letters occasionally, filled with grievances and accusations rather than accountability. I read the first few, then started returning them unopened. Some bridges, once burned, were better left as ash. The extended family fractured and reformed in unexpected ways. Some cousins reached out, sharing their own stories of surviving preparation nights in their households. We formed new traditions together, holiday gatherings where the strongest drink was coffee and the only requirement was showing up as yourself. Other relatives remained loyal to the old ways, convinced we'd overreacted to what they still called harmless family bonding. The Sullivan family reunion, once a 100-strong affair, dwindled to those of us who chose healing over heritage. 5 years after that December night when I called 911, I stood at a podium addressing a conference on intergenerational trauma and addiction. In the audience sat Marcus, sober and healthy, with Alexandra and Elena beside him. My Oregon State roommate Jessica was there too, now a licensed addiction counselor herself. Even Detective Martinez attended, having used our case to develop better training for recognizing abuse in affluent communities. I told our story without euphemism or excuse, laying bare the reality of what happens when family tradition becomes family trauma. I spoke about the seductive nature of belonging, how even poison can taste sweet when it comes with approval and acceptance. I shared the difficulty of breaking cycles when everyone around you insists the wheel should keep turning. But mostly, I talked about hope, about Marcus's recovery, Elena's alcohol-free childhood, the possibility of choosing different even when everything in your history says this is how it's always been done. The question and answer session was intense. Parents asked how to recognize signs their children might be experiencing similar abuse. Young adults shared their own stories of family traditions that required them to hurt themselves for belonging. Professionals sought advice on approaching families where success and abuse intertwined in complex ways. Each question reminded me that our story, as painful as it was, had the power to prevent others from walking the same path. After the conference, Marcus and I sat in a quiet coffee shop, watching Elena color with crayons while Alexandra answered emails. You know what I realized? Marcus said, stirring his tea thoughtfully. They never once told us they loved us without it being connected to drinking. Every "I'm proud of you" came with a shot. Every "you're my son" came with a beer. It was like their love was dissolved in alcohol, and they couldn't figure out how to deliver it any other way. He was right, and the recognition of it still stung. Our parents had been so committed to their tradition that they'd forgotten how to be parents outside of it. Every milestone, every celebration, every moment of connection had been filtered through bottles and measured in tolerance. They'd loved us in their broken way, but that love had been so intertwined with addiction that separating the two had nearly killed us all. Elena looked up from her coloring, her face bright with the uncomplicated joy of childhood. Auntie Sophie, she said, holding up her creation. I made this for you. It's a rainbow, because rainbows come after storms and you helped us through the storm. The wisdom of children never ceased to amaze me. She didn't know the full story yet, wouldn't for years, but somehow she understood that we were a family that had weathered something difficult and emerged on the other side. As we prepared to leave, Marcus pulled me aside. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, he said. Kids in situations like ours. Families that look perfect from the outside but are poison on the inside. Would you help me? I agreed immediately. The Sullivan Foundation would exist not to preserve family tradition, but to break it, to help other children escape the preparation nights and forced bonding that nearly destroyed us. The work was slow and often discouraging. For every family we helped, there were dozens more hiding behind successful careers and social standing. We partnered with schools to educate about the signs of abuse in affluent families. We funded safe houses for young adults escaping family addiction. We created scholarship programs for those whose families cut them off for choosing sobriety. Each small victory felt like reclaiming a piece of what had been stolen from us. I met my partner David at one of our foundation events. He was a social worker specializing in family addiction dynamics, drawn to the work by his own experience as the child of functioning alcoholics. Our first date involved comparing childhood trauma over coffee, which sounds depressing but was actually liberating. Here was someone who understood without explanation why I still flinched when I heard champagne corks pop, why family gatherings required deep breathing exercises, why I needed to control every aspect of alcohol in my environment. Together, we built a life consciously different from what we'd known. Our home was a sanctuary of clear-headed connection, where celebration meant board game nights and hiking trips, where conflict was resolved through conversation rather than intoxication. When friends visited, they sometimes commented on our lack of a bar cart or wine rack, not understanding that their absence was as intentional as any decor choice we'd made. 10 years after that December night, I received a call that my father had died. Heart attack at 62, his body finally succumbing to decades of abuse he'd inflicted on himself while inflicting it on us. My mother wanted me to come to the funeral, to play the role of grieving daughter for the sake of appearances. I declined. The man I might have mourned, the father who existed before preparation nights and family traditions, had been gone for much longer than a decade. Marcus struggled more with the news. Despite everything, part of him still sought the approval that had only ever come through a bottle. We spent long hours processing the complex grief of losing an abusive parent, the way death crystallized the impossibility of ever receiving the apology or accountability we'd secretly hoped for. In the end, he chose not to attend either, recognizing that his sobriety and his daughter's well-being mattered more than performing grief he didn't feel. The Sullivan family tradition died with my father, at least in our branch of the family tree. Cousins in other states might still gather for preparation nights, might still measure love and liquor tolerance, but Marcus and I had broken the chain. Elena grew up attending birthday parties where cake was the only required consumption, where family bonding happened through presents and play rather than proof of endurance. She knew her grandparents existed, but not why we didn't see them, a story we'd tell when she was old enough to understand without internalizing. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I wondered about the life we might have had if our parents had chosen differently. If they'd recognized their own trauma instead of perpetuating it. If they'd sought help instead of shots. If they'd measured our worth in achievements and kindness rather than alcohol tolerance. But that way lay madness and unchangeable history. All we could do was choose differently for ourselves and for the next generation. The foundation grew beyond what we'd imagined. Chapters opened in other cities where similar family traditions flourished in hidden darkness. We developed training programs for teachers, doctors, and social workers to recognize signs of abuse in successful families. We created safe spaces for children and young adults to share their experiences without judgment. Each person we helped felt like retroactive rescue of our younger selves, the children who'd sat at kitchen tables learning to swallow poison and call it love. My mother reached out occasionally over the years, her letters evolving from anger to bargaining to a strange form of denial where she'd rewritten history to make herself the victim. In her version, she'd been a loving mother destroyed by ungrateful children who'd misunderstood family closeness as something sinister. I kept the letters in a file marked evidence, knowing that maintaining no contact was the only way to protect the life I'd built from the poison of her presence. Marcus, the speak. I learned the room I spoke. Others, if Marcus, the reset. How would we handle our own stress without turning to the coping mechanisms we'd been taught? How would we celebrate milestones without the rituals we'd grown up with? How would we teach our children about family history without passing on family trauma? Each question required honest examination and intentional answers. Our daughter was born on a spring morning when the cherry blossoms were blooming outside the hospital window. Holding her, I felt the weight of possibility and responsibility. She would never sit at a kitchen table learning to drink shots. She would never earn parental approval through poison tolerance. She would never wonder if family love required personal destruction. These weren't just hopes, but promises, boundaries drawn in permanent ink around her future. The early years of parenthood brought unexpected healing. Creating new traditions with intention helped highlight how twisted the old ones had been. Family pizza nights where the only competition was who could make the silliest face. Holiday gatherings where presents mattered more than presents, where stories were shared without slurring, where children were protected rather than prepared for some imagined adulthood requirement of chemical endurance. Our son arrived 2 years later, completing a family unit that looked nothing like the one I'd grown up in. David proved that fathers could be present and protective without liquid courage. I discovered that mothers could nurture without numbing. Together, we created a home where emotions were felt rather than drowned, where celebration happened through connection rather than consumption, where the only tradition that mattered was showing up for each other. The foundation work continued, expanding into policy advocacy and legislative change. We pushed for laws that recognized forcing children to consume alcohol as child abuse, regardless of family income or social status. We funded research into intergenerational trauma and its manifestation in successful families. We created support networks for adults still trapped in family systems that required them to poison themselves for belonging. Each victory felt like redemption for the childhoods we couldn't save, including our own. 20 years after that December night, I stood in my childhood home for the first time since calling 911. My mother had died, and the house was being sold to settle the estate. Walking through rooms where trauma had been packaged as tradition felt surreal. The dining room where preparation nights began, the kitchen where shots were poured with precision, my bedroom where they'd tried to force me back into compliance. Each space held ghosts of the children we'd been and the parents they might have been. In my father's study, I found photo albums I'd never seen. Pictures of my parents before children, young and seemingly happy, raising glasses at their own family gatherings. I could trace the progression, watch their faces change from joyful to strained to the hardened masks I remembered. They'd been victims too, trained from birth that love came dissolved in alcohol. The tragedy was that they'd never questioned it, never broken free, choosing instead to pass the poison to the next generation. Marcus helped me sort through what to keep and what to let go. We found our childhood report cards covered in achievements they'd ignored, art projects that had never made it to the refrigerator, essays about family that revealed how early we'd known something was wrong. We saved what mattered and donated the rest, letting strangers carry away the furniture that had witnessed so much dysfunction. The house sold quickly to a young family excited about the good schools and safe neighborhood, blissfully unaware of the darkness that had lived there. The proceeds from the estate went entirely to the foundation, funding a residential program for young adults escaping family addiction. We called it Phoenix House for those rising from the ashes of burned bridges. The first resident was a 19-year-old whose parents had disowned her for refusing to participate in their family's version of preparation nights. Watching her walk through the doors, scared but determined, felt like welcoming a younger version of myself home. My children grew up knowing their family history in age-appropriate pieces. They understood that some grandparents were too sick to be safe, that some family traditions were better left buried, that choosing health sometimes meant choosing distance. They also grew up surrounded by the chosen family we'd built, people who understood that love meant support rather than shots, that celebration happened through presence rather than proof of tolerance. The ripple effects of our story continued spreading in ways we couldn't have imagined. Former students reached out years later to say our speaking engagement had given them courage to address their own family dynamics. Therapists incorporated our case into their training. Policymakers cited our experience when crafting legislation protecting children in affluent families. Each impact reminded us that breaking the cycle had been about more than just saving ourselves. Marcus developed his own speaking career, focusing on recovery and rebuilding after family trauma. His story of near-death and resurrection resonated particularly with young men trapped in toxic family systems that equated masculinity with chemical endurance. He showed them that strength meant choosing sobriety, that courage meant breaking tradition, that being a real man had nothing to do with matching your father drink for drink until your liver failed. As our children entered their teenage years, we faced new challenges. How to prepare them for a world where drinking was normalized without traumatizing them with our history. How to teach them about peer pressure when we'd experienced parental pressure. How to help them navigate social situations we'd never learned to handle without alcohol. Each conversation required balancing honesty with age appropriateness, protection with preparation. They surprised us with their resilience and wisdom. Our daughter became a peer counselor at school, helping classmates navigate family addiction issues. Our son started a support group for students in recovery or choosing sobriety. They understood their family legacy not as shame to hide, but as strength forged through survival. They chose their friends carefully, surrounding themselves with people who respected their boundaries and understood their choices. The Foundation's work evolved as we recognized new patterns in family addiction. Social media created new ways for families to hide dysfunction behind curated perfection. Economic success provided new shields against intervention. We developed programs addressing these modern manifestations while maintaining focus on the core issue that family tradition should never require personal destruction. Each innovation came from listening to survivors and recognizing that trauma evolved even as its core remained constant. 30 years after that December night, I received an invitation that stopped me cold. A cousin I'd lost touch with was getting married and wanted to reconnect. She'd grown up in one of the other families implicated in our case, had gone through her own journey of recovery and reconciliation. Her invitation came with a note promising that their celebration would be alcohol-free, that she wanted to honor all the cousins who'd survived by choosing differently. The wedding was a revelation. Cousins I hadn't seen in decades gathered to celebrate new beginnings. Some had struggled with addiction themselves before finding recovery. Others had maintained sobriety through sheer determination. All had stories of breaking free from family traditions that required self-harm disguised as bonding. We danced without stumbling, told stories without slurring, connected without chemical assistance. It was the family gathering we should have had all along. That night, Marcus and I sat on the hotel balcony, looking out over a city that had nothing to do with our childhood trauma. We'd survived. More than that, we'd thrived. We'd built lives and families and a foundation that helped others escape what we'd endured. The Sullivan family tradition had died with our parents, but what we'd built in its place was so much stronger. Connection based on choice rather than obligation, love demonstrated through presence rather than proof of tolerance, traditions that honored rather than harmed. Looking back now, I can see how that December night when I called 911 was both an ending and a beginning. It ended the Sullivan family as we'd known it, destroyed relationships that had been built on poison foundations. But it began everything else. Marcus's sobriety and survival. Elena and her siblings' childhood free from preparation nights. the foundation that had helped thousands recognize and escape family addiction. My own journey from surviving to thriving, from victim to advocate, from silence to speech. The cost had been everything we thought family meant. The gain had been everything family should actually be. Every relationship lost had been replaced with ones based on mutual respect rather than mandatory destruction. Every tradition abandoned had made room for new ones that celebrated rather than subjugated. Every bridge burned had cleared the path for roads that led somewhere worth going. If I could tell my 11-year-old self anything as she sat at that dining room table facing her first preparation night, it would be this: you will survive this. You will save your brother. You will break the cycle. The family you lose will be nothing compared to the family you build. The traditions that seem so important will reveal themselves as the generational trauma they are. You will call 911 on a December night when you're 20, and that call will save not just your life, but the lives of children not yet born who will never know preparation nights because you chose to break the chain. The Sullivan family tradition is dead. We killed it with that phone call, those prosecutions, this foundation, these stories. And in its place, we built something beautiful. Families where love doesn't require proof of tolerance. Celebrations that don't center on intoxication. Children who know they're valued for who they are rather than what they can endure. The tradition now is health, honesty, and connection without chemical mediation. It's not as sophisticated as my parents' crystal decanters and carefully curated wine cellars, but it's real, and it's ours, and it doesn't require anyone to poison themselves to belong. That's the legacy we're leaving. Not a family tradition of forced drinking, but a foundation of chosen sobriety. Not preparation nights, but prevention programs. Not generational trauma, but generational healing. The Sullivan name, which once stood for sophisticated self-destruction, now stands for survival and support. And that transformation, bought with pain but built with purpose, is worth every bridge we had to burn to achieve it. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is still and my family sleeps safely in their beds, I think about the journey that brought us here. The 11-year-old girl who sat at that mahogany dining table, throat burning from her first forced shot of whiskey, could never have imagined the life I'm living now. She was too busy surviving to dream of thriving, too focused on endurance to envision transformation. But she carried within her a seed of resistance that would eventually bloom into revolution, not just for herself, but for an entire family lineage. The work continues because the need continues. Every week brings new families to our foundation, each with their own version of preparation night, their own sophisticated justifications for generational harm. We see families where academic achievement is forced through pharmaceutical abuse, where athletic success comes through dangerous training regimens that break young bodies, where artistic expression is cultivated through emotional manipulation that breaks young spirits. Methods vary, but the pattern remains the same. Parents reproducing their own trauma, convinced they're creating excellence when they're actually creating damage. What gives me hope is the growing awareness that family tradition should never require family sacrifice. More young people are finding the courage to question what they've been taught, to seek help when home feels harmful, to choose their own health over heritage. The support groups we run are filled with survivors at every stage of their journey, from those still planning their escape to those building new lives free from the patterns that once defined them. Each story shared makes the next person's freedom more possible. I think about Elena and her generation often, these children who will never know the weight of wine glasses thrust into small hands, who will never learn to measure their worth in their ability to swallow poison without flinching. They're growing up with a different understanding of family, one where love isn't proven through endurance of harm, but through consistent presence and protection. They're free in ways we had to fight to become, and that freedom is perhaps the greatest gift we could give them. The ripples continue spreading. Former residents of Phoenix House have gone on to become therapists, social workers, teachers, and parents who understand the signs of family dysfunction because they lived them. They're positioned throughout communities, watchful guardians who know that abuse doesn't always look like poverty or obvious neglect. They know to look closer at the star student who flinches at the sound of clinking glasses, at the successful executive's child who seems too perfect, too controlled, too careful never to disappoint. Marcus and I still meet for coffee every week, a tradition we started in those early days of his recovery and have maintained for decades. We don't talk about our parents much anymore. There's nothing left to say about people who chose poison over their children, who went to their graves believing they were victims of ungrateful offspring rather than perpetrators of systematic abuse. Instead, we talk about our children, our work, our lives built on foundations of choice rather than coercion. We've become the adults we needed when we were children, and there's profound healing in that transformation. The Sullivan family tradition is truly dead, buried with the last of the generation that believed in it. What lives on is something entirely different, a legacy of breaking free rather than breaking down, of choosing health over heritage, of recognizing that the most loving thing you can do for your children is refuse to pass on your own trauma. It's a harder path than simply repeating what you know, requiring constant vigilance and conscious choice. But it's a path that leads to life rather than the slow death we were raised to accept. In the end, that's what this story is about. Not just the dramatic December night when I called 911, or the trials that followed, or even the foundation we built from the ashes. It's about the daily choice to do differently, to be differently, to create family traditions that celebrate rather than subjugate. It's about proving that cycles can be broken, that genetics isn't destiny, that the poison stops here. Every sober celebration, every clear-headed connection, every child who grows up without fear of Friday nights is a victory over the voices that still sometimes whisper that we're betraying our blood by choosing not to poison it. The journey from that first preparation night to now has been longer than the miles suggest, through territories of trauma and healing that no map could chart. But we made it, Marcus and I and all the cousins who chose freedom over family tradition. We made it to the other side where love doesn't require proof of tolerance, where belonging doesn't demand self-destruction, where the only preparation our children need is for lives lived fully, honestly, and free from the shadows of sipped poison disguised as sophistication. And that, more than any Sullivan family tradition could ever be, is worth passing on.